Okay, good evening, everybody. Sorry for my rather Rod Stewart voice today. Let me introduce myself. I'm Wong Keng Siong. I'm the co-president of the SUSS, Doctor of Business Administration, Alumni and Student Community. So this is the second session of our joint event together with the Middle East Institute, who has kindly provided the speakers, a stellar cast of speakers for us. Today we have another superstar. You would have seen him on TV. Since you're not here to listen to me, you're obviously here to listen to him. Let me just introduce you quickly. Dr. John Root here. He is an expert in Middle East security. And in my conversation with him just now, I also learned that he has actually spent some time in the UAE. So I don't think there's any better speaker than we have today to talk about the topic, which is the UAE pedaling faster than the rest of the carpet. Dr. John.
Okay, so I'll be brief, about 30 minutes, just to give you an introduction on the UAE. I don't know how much you know about the UAE. I mean, we actually have only like this. Okay. I assume we have the people here have either traveled to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi. So what I'm going to do is basically going through four elements in this presentation, looking at domestic politics in the UAE, threats and challenges right now seen from Abu Dhabi, priorities in the UAE foreign policy, and finally, because this is tailored for a business audience, one would be the major unknowns if your company is based in the UAE, or if you are traveling regularly to the UAE, what are the things that you should be aware of in terms of the general environment? So the big question maybe is it really safe and stable to sit at the top of Burj Khalifa, just like Tom Cruise did on this picture? That's the only time I'm going to use culture references. I thought this was just, and that this would be a cool presentation. The rest of it will be much more about politics, security, and serious stuff. So let's move right away to the next slide. Okay, so, and to understand the UAE, and again, this is just a 30-minute presentation, so I'll be very short on that. But to understand the UAE, we need to go back in history. We need to go back to 1971, the moment this picture was taken. The UAE, so literally the United Arab Emirates, is a federal experiment. What I mean by experiment is that this is the first and only time so far that seven small entities, so emirates, gathered and build one common state. Those that are the most known to the people usually are Abu Dhabi, which is where you have the capital city. And here you have the founder, Sheikh Zayed, who was the first president of the United Arab Emirates. The other big city, which is obviously known to everyone, is Dubai. So with Sheikh Rashid, who's here, who was at the time the ruler of Dubai. But you have, and that's something that people tend to forget, the UAE is not just about Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but you have 5 other emirates that I'll be discussing later. Why is it important? Because until today, if you travel to the UAE, you will see differences in terms of just cultural differences. And Emiratis are very proud about their local identities. I mean, someone will tell you he's from Sharjah or he's from Ajman, and that it makes a difference in terms of how their identity is shaped. even in the language, they will tell you that there are differences in the slang, the dialect from one emirate to another. This is also important at the legal level because the law will be different. I mean, there's a general framework at the federal level, but the laws can be different, for instance, in terms of alcohol consumption. I mean, the typical example is that you have an emirate such as Sharjah, where alcohol consumption is forbidden, which is completely different from Dubai, which is like a 5-minute ride from Sharjah. So it is also important to keep in mind the federal element because there isn't like equal wealth among the 7 emirates. I'll come back to that later, but basically, as of today, most of the oil reserve, when we think about the UAE, we think first about oil. That is true, except that most of the oil reserves today are in Abu Dhabi. So that means that from the beginning, part of the arrangement between Abu Dhabi, the capital, and the rest of the country was that Abu Dhabi would redistribute the wealth from the oil in exchange for that federal system. So that meant that the other rulers had to accept the idea that they would get parts of the oil incomes in exchange for joining the federation. And again, this is, I mean, in retrospect, this was a success story, but we have to keep in mind that in 71, a lot of the people didn't believe this would last. The British diplomats at the time, if you look at the archive, were very skeptical. This was a very small a country, 7 different emirates with a history of rivalries, competition. So bets were quite against this experiment, but that actually worked, and this led to the UAE as we know today. The second element, which is very important, is the idea of an Abu Dhabi-Dubai competition. It is a competition that, it is a competition in the sense that Dubai has a different, I would say, culture, different tradition when it comes to business, when it comes to politics. It is traditionally a merchant city, which had an older history than Abu Dhabi in that domain. And until today, that also explains the differences in terms of the trajectory. Dubai was much more business-oriented than Abu Dhabi. And if you look at a lot of the experiences in the UAE when it comes to non-oil industries, this is first and foremost Dubai. So that is part of the competition. This led to a major milestone, a major moment, turning point, I would say, in the history of the country, which was 2009, after the financial crisis. You may remember that when there was the financial crisis, sector in Dubai basically crashed. Most of the debt of Dubai at the time was saved, was bought by the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. And the logic is that since then, Abu Dhabi has been much more in charge of the big decisions in the UAE. So to make it short, when we talk about the most important decisions, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to relations with the US, relations with China, most of that is decided by Abu Dhabi. It doesn't mean that there's no role at all for Dubai, but the big decisions, they all come at the level of the presidency in Abu Dhabi. Let's talk about 2 other aspects here which are important, the stabilizing effect of the oil rent. So can we move to the next slide? Okay, so just as a reminder, and I'm sure most of you would know, I mean, the UAE is among one of the biggest exporters of crude oil today. So you can see here, sixth position. But it's also important, that's at the international level, but it's also important to look at that, the role of oil also from a domestic standpoint. So that would be the next slide. Okay. The previous slide showed the government expenditures, and the fiscal balance inside the UAE. And basically, the idea of the slide was to show you that when oil prices are high, fiscal balance is in good shape in the UAE. In other words, although the UAE is probably one of is actually the best player when it comes to non-oil diversification in the Gulf, until today, its fiscal balance, the moment the balance is even, it depends until today on oil prices. So that means that the economy is not yet has not yet reached the point of true robust diversification. We saw that, for instance, during the 2020, 2021 period after COVID, when you had negative numbers for oil inputs. And as a result, the fiscal balance was negative as well. Today, thanks to the period that followed, and in particular after the increase of oil prices after the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, fiscal balance is positive again. Okay, the reason I'm mentioning that is that, as I said, part of the federal experiment involves redistribution of the oil income from Abu Dhabi to the rest of the country. And this is particularly important for not Dubai, but for what we call the Northern Emirates. So that would be Al Quwain, Ras Al Khaimah, Fujairah, which are smaller emirates that have no oil and which are considered poor emirates, in the sense that if you travel there, if you go to Fujairah, you'll see that there isn't the same level of development when it comes to infrastructures, when it comes to public services. And so it was critical in the for the stability of the country, for the cohesion of the country, that the oil income would be redistributed to those smaller emirates. And it was also a matter of social economic stability, but it has also become over the last 2 decades an issue at the security level. I'll come back to that, but because of the lower level of social economic development in those emirates, the issue was that they would be more inclined to be exposed to radical ideology, and in particular from Muslim Brotherhood. So part of the idea was redistributing the oil reserve, strengthening those emirates, is also a way to prevent the spread of Islamism to those emirates. So that's at the domestic level. And again, I mean, we have time after that for Q&A if you'd like to ask questions, because I emphasize that this is just an overview. What are the threats and challenges when you're based in Abu? How do you look at your security environment? And I thought it was worth mentioning a few things which may not be known about the UAE environment. Two main topics here: Iran and Islamism. Iran would be considered as a strategic challenge, and Islamism would be considered as an existential threat. Why Iran? The first most obvious item is the existence of a territorial dispute between the UAE and Iran. If you ask Emirati officials, that's probably one of the first topics that will come into the discussion. The fact that in 1971, so right before the creation of the UAE, the Iranian regime, so that was at the time of the Shah, so before the Islamic Revolution, the Iranians took 3 small islands. So Abu Musa that you have here, Lesser Thumb and Greater Thumb, which are very small islands, but until today, the UAE consider them to be illegally occupied by Iran. Plus, the UAE also reports or estimate that the Iranians have deployed ballistic missiles on Abu Musa. That leads to another topic, which is the UAE has been one of the most active actors in the region against Iran's nuclear program and against Iran's ballistic programs. Because in both cases, given the proximity, this is almost like an immediate threat for the UAE. Because this means that Iran could easily target any urban areas. In addition to that, there's also what we call proxy war, the fact that Iran has supported groups across the Middle East that have been fighting openly with the UAE. The biggest case is the Houthis, a militia in Yemen that has been fighting against the UAE and Saudi Arabia since the war started in 2015. The UAE has been engaged in the war for a long time, but the Houthis also brought the war to the UAE. So 2022, you may remember in January, the Houthis fired missiles and drones at Abu Dhabi. There were, as far as I remember, 3 people getting killed, but that was a major shock for the UAE. And it is, I mean, the systems that the Houthis were using that they fired on the UAE were, for most of them, were supplied by Iran. So that is also one of the reasons until today relations have been extremely tensed with the Iranian regime. The other aspect, very quickly, is Islamism. This is at the level, it is first in terms of the ideology. The UAE has been extremely active at promoting the idea of fighting the ideology of Islamism, the idea that this is a political Islam that fuels radicalization. And there's the idea that there's a domino effect, that when Islamist forces get control of one country, they eventually want to get control of other countries. That's the reason the UAE was very active in the last decade following the Arab Spring. The UAE was involved in Egypt to support the Marshal Sisi, who's the current president of Egypt, against the former regime of the Muslim Brothers. The Emiratis have been also involved in other places, in Libya, where they supported the forces of General Haftar. Again, the logic in each of those cases is that the UAE will support either financially, militarily, diplomatically, actors that they consider to fight against a political Islam. Sometimes this backfires, and maybe the most obvious case right now is Sudan, where the UAE has been for years supporting the military establishment, and in particular, most recently, the Rapid Support Forces, which have been, in some cases, involved in the massacres across the country. The UAE diplomatically deny its involvement, but this, I mean, it is a fact that the UAE has maintained close ties to the members, in particular the ruler of the Rapid Support Forces, General Hemeti. But that is one example of how it backfires. But the logic again is that this is driven by the idea that Islamism is an existential threat to the stability, not just of the UAE, but of the region as a whole. That is for, let's say, how threats and challenges are perceived in Abu Dhabi. What are now, very quickly, the priorities in UAE foreign policy? And I'll mention just a few of them. There are others that could be on this slide, but I thought I'll give you just a highlight. First, the UAE until today considers itself as a reliable partner of Western countries. And in particular, two countries are important for Abu Dhabi: the US and, to a lesser extent, France. I'll also say a few words on the role of China and India, and also about the impact of the normalization with Israel. Next slide, please. So the US until today is still a major player when it comes to the stability of not just the UAE, but the region as a whole. This is a map taken in 2021, but in terms of the footprint, it is roughly the same numbers as of today. So you have 5,000 US soldiers which are still deployed in the UAE. There's a defense agreement between both countries. The UAE is among the countries that buy the biggest number of arms from the US when it comes to fighter jets in particular. And this means that until today, the UAE considers its security to be tied to the partnership with the US. And it is very important, because if you look at the news, anytime there's speculations about the UAE shifting towards China, you will have the UAE government making very cautious statements saying that it still considers the US to be its biggest ally. And that is something very important to keep in mind. Okay, as I'm French, I couldn't talk about the UAE without mentioning the role of the UAE-France relationship. But it is not just because I'm French. It is also because it is part of the UAE foreign policy arrangements. Until today, there are bigger military ties between the UAE and France than between UAE and Russia, or between UAE and China. There's a lot of speculations, but if you look at the relationship at the strategic level, it is much bigger with France. France has a military base in Abu Dhabi where you have about 800 soldiers on a permanent basis. In addition to that, I didn't put a picture of Total, the oil company, but Total has been a player, has been a recipient of oil concessions in Abu Dhabi since the 30s. For the small anecdote, the moment France opened the military base in Abu Dhabi was the same year Total renewed its concession rights with the UAE, and that was part of the discussion. Both elements were discussed together by the governments. Well, interestingly, the relationship is also vibrant at different levels. It's also a partnership that involves education, with the creation of Sorbonne Abu Dhabi in 2005, if I remember correctly, and also at the cultural level with the opening of the Louvre Abu Dhabi in 2017. So this is, and that's actually, if you look on the map, the military base, the Sorbonne, and the Louvre are in the small area. It's almost like a triangle within Abu Dhabi, around the port of Abu Dhabi. So it is, I think, one illustration also of that dynamic relationship, and the fact that it's, again, not just about the US, that the UAE is considering different partners in its, let's say, foreign policy arrangements. Now, let's move to Asia, because any discussion on the UAE these days could not be possible without including the Asia mention. The most important, or maybe the most obvious reason why we should discuss the UAE pivot to Asia is this breakdown of the oil exports of the UAE. If you look at it, because we tend to say that the oil policy, or the foreign policy will be shaped by oil. If you look at it, overwhelmingly, UAE oil goes to Asia. And so Europe now is not really relevant in that domain. And the biggest, some of the biggest actors, when you look at the details, will be Japan, China, India. Now, having said that, it's not just about oil. It was about, I would say that 10, 15 years ago, it was mostly just about oil. But what we saw in the last 10 years is also diversification of the different domains of the cooperation between Asian countries and the UAE. I'll give you just two examples, with India and with China. So with India, the UAE already had a very close relationship, first and foremost because of the labor, the workers coming from India in the UAE. Roughly speaking, you have about 3 million out of 10 million people living in UAE that are Indians. So that is actually the biggest number. The first population in the UAE before the Emiratis is Indians. So that's the reason, also the first obvious reason why there was a close tie. But what we saw also in the last 10 years, especially after Narendra Modi came to power, is a strategic relationship that is driven by different elements, counterterrorism, in the sense that both Modi and Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi have a very close, similar assessment on the threat of political Islam and Islamism. And that led to a lot of cooperation in counterterrorism. And also infrastructures. The UAE started investing in Indian infrastructures in 2017. And most recently, both countries announced going ahead with infrastructure projects as part of the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. So that is one example. There's also another example, which is a trilateral arrangement between UAE, India, and France, where the three countries exchange on strategic and economic items, economic priorities. Another major and obvious actor is China. And again, this is around the same time. This is the moment when Xi Jinping came to power in China, and also after he announced the Belt and Road Initiative. The UAE after that became extremely active in courting Chinese investors in the UAE. This led to a major presidential visit to the UAE of Xi Jinping in 2018, if I remember correctly. And a few months after that, China announced that it would buy 9% of the container terminal of Abu Dhabi port, which is an unprecedented move. Usually Emiratis would keep at least 50% of such a infrastructure. But that was reflecting how much the UAE was getting closer to China. Other aspects of the cooperation have involved 5G network through Huawei, but most recently also arms sales. And that is also something which is an indicator that the UAE is getting more and more serious about its relations with China. It involves buying drones from China, but also most recently buying light fighter jets from China, so 2 years ago. And that's actually the first Gulf country that went ahead with fighter jets from China. Quickly, because it's also very important to keep in mind that the UAE was in 2021 the first country to go ahead with the first Gulf state to go ahead with normalization with Israel. Before that, there was no normalization, meaning that none of the Gulf states recognized Israel. A month after the UAE announced that it was normalizing ties with Israel, Bahrain followed. And now there's still speculation that maybe Saudi Arabia would be the next one. Since then, it's quite impressive until I would say the Gaza war, how far the UAE went in its cooperation with Israel. The UAE is the only Arab state that signed a free trade agreement with Israel. So far, even though you had Egypt and Jordan that normalized ties with Israel decades ago, the only Arab state that signed a free trade agreement is the UAE. Having said that, I mean, we could talk for an hour about this topic, but having said that, following the Gaza war, the UAE has been in a very delicate situation. Obviously, the Gaza war has triggered a lot of discontent, frustration, not just in the Arab world in general, but inside the UAE itself. So diplomatically, the UAE has been very careful to say that it would not stop normalization with Israel, but at the same time, it has been extremely careful to condemn Israel's operations in Gaza. There are nuances in the sense that Israel condemned Hamas attacks on October 7, which is not the case of all the Arab states by far. But after that, especially after the first month of the war in Gaza, the UAE started condemning very clearly the operation, and then started also participating to the humanitarian efforts inside Gaza. But again, so far there's no sign that this is affecting, let's say, the long-term trajectory of the UAE when it comes to its relationship with Israel. Okay, so, and I thought this was mostly just to open the conversation. What would be the major unknowns for the business and for the business environment if we look at the UAE? Because the UAE and the first point is that the UAE is probably one of the most stable countries as of today in the Middle East, and in particular in the Gulf. When you look at the economic indicators, or if you look at domestic politics, there's no sign today of any challenge to the government. So if we were to discuss physical security threats, I would argue that the only concern we have is the spillover of a regional conflict. That's why I mentioned earlier the attack of the Houthis on Abu Dhabi. That was 2021. Since then, there has not been any new attack, but this is something to keep in mind, that the UAE is a stable country in the middle of a region that is not. And until today, that was part of the strategy of the UAE to be immune to what is happening in the other countries. We'll see how much this is sustainable, but as mentioned in 2021, that was actually a reality check, that the UAE cannot be completely isolated from what's happening in the rest of the region. Two other elements to keep in mind very quickly: the US-China competition, the fact that the UAE until today wants to keep close ties to both. And until today, UAE thinks that it is possible to get closer to China in, let's say, domains that are considered sensitive to Washington without facing pressure from the US. We see that this is less and less possible. And most recently, Abu Dhabi announced that it would stop cooperating with Chinese entities in the field of artificial intelligence. This is mostly a way to convey the message to Washington that it is considering the demands of the US. And that relates to the fact that at the end of the day, the UAE, when it comes to security, heavily relies on the US, and China is not going to be an alternative. So China doesn't want, probably, and doesn't and cannot compensate for, let's say, a withdrawal from the US forces. Finally, another element that could play a role is new intra-Gulf tensions. You may remember 2017, the UAE participated to the blockade of Qatar. Acts for not just for politics, but for business. That meant that if your company was based both in Doha and in, let's say, Dubai, the people that were in the past commuting between both cities had to connect to other destinations, either to Kuwait, or to Oman. Right now, we're experiencing a rather quiet period between Gulf states, but this is not. That doesn't mean that we won't see a revival of intra-Gulf tensions. That doesn't mean that we would go back to a block of Qatar, but that could actually be between other countries. That could be because Saudi Arabia is more and more pushing for its own reforms, want to get most business companies to relocate to Riyadh. And as a result, this could lead to tensions with other countries. So that is something that that surely the UAE and business companies based in the UAE are to consider. So that is another risk. I wouldn't say it's a short-term risk, but it is a mid-term risk. And on that, I'll stop. Sorry for being really too long. And we have, I think, time now for a discussion. Thank you.
Now I open questions to the floor, please. Anybody? Online also can ask, right?
I'll kick off with an easy one. UAE, Singapore. I think you said that they're kind of building their more relationships towards Asia, specifically China and India. Is there anything towards Singapore in terms of an investment? Do they see Singapore as kind of like a significant enough player that this is kind of going to become a thing over the next decade or so?
Okay, so thank you for the question. And I'm sure my colleagues can also jump in on this topic. The way I see it, Singapore for a long time was seen as a model, one of inspiration among others, for especially Dubai, because there's this idea that the development of Singapore is something that can influence the strategy of Dubai. Beyond that, there are good diplomatic relations, regular visits from both sides. I mean, I would give you the response from someone who works on foreign policy. The UAE doesn't really look at Southeast Asia in general as its priority. It sees Southeast Asia as one interesting area where there's investment possible, but mostly that would be Indonesia. In the past, Malaysia, but then there has been troubles at the bilateral level. But in terms of the priorities, there isn't like a big interest. So that's my view. Because when we are based in Singapore, we tend to look at the visits from the UAE thinking that this indicates interest. But when you're based in the UAE, and I was based in the UAE for 5 years, Singapore is rarely mentioned, apart from it is an inspiration for the Dubai development. That there's always positive views, but it's just that in terms of foreign policy priorities, there isn't much beyond, let's say, having good trade relations and so on. Plus, again, if my colleagues disagree, they're free to correct me. The economies are quite different, also in the sense that the UAE is not. It's not. I mean, most of the trade of the UAE will be driven by oil. So that will be mostly in terms of the flow of commodities going to Singapore port. But in terms of, let's say, startups, I doubt there's a lot of, I'm talking about the macro level. I'm sure there are experiences, but for the UAE, that's not going to be the first thing that comes to mind when they talk about Singapore.
Thank you. So I look at the relationship between the UAE and Singapore from the energy perspective. Actually, Singapore does import natural gas from the UAE. And now, because there's a decarbonization going on, hydrogen is one of the area that the two countries are looking at. And also because UAE hosted COP28 last year. And Singapore is seen from the Gulf as a model, even in the climate policies perspective. So there's a lot of signing of a memorandum of understanding and cooperation to learn from Singapore experience on climate policies. So with that, can I ask also a question? So also on the Iran and UAE relationship, do you think the geopolitical and the political tensions between the countries mask their economic and trade relations? Because I am from Oman and we go to the UAE, there is an Iran market in Dubai, in Sharjah. So I believe the products come from Iran, right?
Yeah, that's a good question in the sense that it leads to the big paradox, the fact that one of the most assertive countries in the area when it came to the nuclear issue, and the UAE actually praised Donald Trump when Donald Trump rejected and withdrew US commitment from the JCPOA. As you said, if you look at the economy, the UAE didn't apply the sanctions that the US and the Western countries were applying against Iran. And Dubai is de facto the gateway for the Iranian economy to the rest of the world. This actually highlights the differences, I would say, between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, because the more hawkish or let's say assertive view with regards to Iran comes from Abu Dhabi. They won't apply sanctions. So that explains this products where the UAE will say at the UN or will say to any meetings at diplomatic level that the Iranians have to and that the US has to be tougher on the topic, especially during the Obama presidency. At the same time, they are completely ignoring sanctions. And if I go even deeper, the US talks that were involved in the nuclear program or in the ballistic program, if you look, and this is actually open, this is public knowledge, public data, a lot of those companies are registered in Dubai. And again, I don't think this is duplicity. I don't think this is the UAE playing both sides. I think it's just that there's a laissez-faire mindset and a lot of business regulations in the past that needed to be much more implemented in Dubai. Okay, so I'll say the question just. Do you think that the UAE can exert pressure by helping to resolve the Israel-Hamas war? Or on the contrary, do you agree with Fatih Hadazi Heni that the UAE has lost its credibility to play a role in the negotiation with the signing of the Abraham Accords. Moreover, according to the thesis, Saudi Arabia could play a much bigger role than the UAE in this ceasefire. Okay, that's like almost 3 different questions together. So if I sum up the question is, it relates to the idea. Sorry, I want to steal your phone. It relates to the idea of when the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, it said, and that was the main selling point, it said that because the UAE normalized relations with Israel, Israel stopped its plan to annex the West Bank. In other words, that the normalization gave leverage to the UAE. A few months later, you had a first war, actually a previous war between Hamas and Israel, 2021, if you remember, where there was already a first test for the UAE. Would the UAE be involved in the settlement, in the mediation? They were not. You had 2 Arab countries which were involved. These were Qatar and Egypt. What we see today is the same, that the UAE has not been able to make the case that the Abraham Accords give them more leverage. Having said that, in a way, you could argue that not a lot of countries right now have any leverage on Israel. Even the US, I would argue, has limited leverage. They may have leverage when we talk about arms supplies, but at the end of the day, I don't think that even if the US was tomorrow stopping arms supplies to Israel, this would have a tremendous impact on the Israeli policy right now in Gaza. That's another topic, but meaning that, to go back to the question, yes, I don't think they have leverage. Does that weaken the credibility of their narrative? Probably. I would say that it may weaken it as long as people believe the narrative in the first place. I'm not sure that people really believe that the UAE had stopped annexation of the West Bank. Plus, the fact was that this was already undermined even before the war with the new Netanyahu government, with people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir that announced before the October war that they would go ahead with annexation. To go back to the other question, which is about Saudi Arabia, no, I don't think Saudi Arabia is in a better position to impose a ceasefire. And again, I would come back to the fact that even Qatar today, which has more leverage because of its role with Hamas, even Qatar is unable to bring about this ceasefire. At the end of the day, I think you have 2 persons that can deliver, that can decide on this ceasefire. It's Yahya Sinwar in Gaza and Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. So that's it. I mean, external players may have a role on long-term relations, but right now in the context of the war, I don't see either Saudi Arabia or the UAE being able to do that. And I think right now the strategy, at least at the UN level, the UN Security Council level of the UAE, is more and more to prepare for what's happening after the war. So that's when you look at their latest statements, when you look at the op-ed that the UAE representative to the UN wrote a few weeks ago, this is more about what comes after when we talk about reconstruction of Gaza.
Hi, the question was related to Iran. In your presentation, you had shown a few islands which were disputed between UAE and Iran. But on a broader level, there is, or on an underlying difference in the sectarianism between the Shias and the Sunnis, which have been existing for so many years. So do you think that this Shia regime, which is in Iran, would tone down their rhetoric and come to a settled peace anytime soon in the Middle East or in the Persian Gulf area, because this sectarianism has been going on for centuries between the Arabs and the Persians. So it's a long-standing one.
And it's a question that actually will be also covered in the other lectures, because it's not just with the UAE that is relevant also. That is relevant. Okay, that is relevant also with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain. In the case of the UAE, when you look at the social fabric of the UAE, there is a very small Shia minority. I don't remember the numbers, but it's not as significant as it is, for instance, with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain, where they are the majority, or with Kuwait, where there's a significant Shia minority. The sectarian narrative, the idea that there's a war or there's a conflict between the Shia and the Sunni, was particularly salient in the political narrative, I would say, in the last decade, especially after the Arab Spring. This was a moment where it was everywhere. And when you ask Gulf officials, they would very often come back to that. It seems to me that it has been toned down in the last years, and for different reasons. The first one, the most obvious reason, is that Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE started looking for reconciliations to see if maybe that could actually help to de-escalate the tensions. And as a result, we see less at the official level the idea of this sectarian struggle. It doesn't mean that it is not something in the mind of the decision makers. I think it's part of the folklore, but I don't think it's a major aspect when it comes to the policies. And the other reason is that personally, I don't think this is a driver. This would be more about nationalism than about sectarian identities. You mentioned, and I found it interesting that you talked about the Persian Gulf. If we were in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai, you would have an Emirati interrupting you and saying, no, this is not the Persian Gulf, this is the Arabian Gulf. And this has nothing to do with Shia or Sunni. This has something to do with national identities. I think this is also a good example that the sectarian narrative was weaponized in the last decade, but over time, I think it's more about national identity and national rivalries, and the dispute over naming the Persian Gulf is just one of different examples on that.
When you speak about the UAE paddling faster than the Gulf Pact, I think essentially for any businesses coming from Singapore, we're talking about Abu Dhabi or Dubai. Yeah. But costs in this Abu Dhabi and Dubai are going relatively high. Is there any other Emirati state Singapore businesses could focus on as well, apart from Abu Dhabi and Dubai, in your opinion?
So, as far as I know, there are programs in terms of like incentives for opening new companies, tax incentives in the Emirates, especially the Emirates which are close to Dubai, like Ras Al Khaimah. Fujairah also has this type of programs, but maybe Clemens, you have maybe more inputs on this.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words. I think if you're talking about the Northern Emirates, the one closest to Oman on the northernmost tip, which is Ras Al Khaimah, has had several interesting developments in the last 2 years, including an integrated resort that they want to do similar to us, IR. So they will have a casino as part of the IR, which is, of course, according to Islam, is supposed to be forbidden, but they are working out the regulations at the moment. The latest we have seen from the news is that they have lottery being legalized which is the latest news. So we will see where that is headed. But if one of them, which is Ras Al Khaimah, is doing it, I think, and that would be the litmus test or the guinea pig. So if that will succeed, then I guess the main emirate, which are Dubai and Abu Dhabi, may follow suit.
So I just opened our company's office in UAE. So what happens is there are two types of entities there. So there is either a free zone entity. So free zones are practically one tower standing, and then you can start your company there. Or there is a mainland company. Mainland company can operate anywhere in UAE. So previously, the mainland companies could not be owned 100% by a foreigner. But now, since last 2 years, I think it was 21 or 22, they came up with a new rule by which a foreigner can have 100% ownership of a mainland company. So I have started a mainland company. So it is independent of, technically it is independent of which emirate you are working. You can have it registered in Dubai. You can have an office in Abu Dhabi. You can have a branch office in Ras Al Khaimah, Ajman. Anyway, so then again, answering to that gentleman's question, the incentives are decided by the free zones. If you're going for the free zones, which used to be the traditional way of opening a company in Dubai, which is a DMCC company in JLT or an Ajman free zone. So these used to be dictated by that particular entity on how you can open and what kind of trade activities you can carry on. So like most of the commodity traders used to be based out of DMCC in JLT area. And, if you go to Abu Dhabi, it's Abu Dhabi free zone area, so which has more, or the Jebel Ali free zone area, which is more into productions. So the free zone is a different animal altogether, and then the mainland companies can operate anywhere. So they have liberalized the structure quite a lot now. So I just have a very recent experience of that.
Okay, so is the rivalry between Abu Dhabi and Dubai resolved, or is it just a temporary calm? It's a challenging question. I would argue that the rivalry has been resolved almost 10 years ago because Abu Dhabi won. And there's no real debate. I mean, first, if you for those who are not familiar with the customs in the UAE, nobody would talk about that openly there. It's that would be against protocol or just against the customs. It would be seen as offensive to discuss openly the rivalry between both cities. But having said that, if we want to be pragmatic and look at indicators when it comes to the big decisions, the levers of power, this is Abu Dhabi. When it comes to economy, when it comes to sovereign wealth fund, when it comes to oil, when it comes to security, defense, this is Abu Dhabi. If you look at the names of the individuals which are in charge of the main entities driven the power of the country, these are close advisors or family members of the president Mohammed bin Zayed. So again, I mean, I'm not saying that Dubai has no role, but when it comes to the big decisions of the country, it is now Abu Dhabi. When it comes to our relations with China or India, it is Abu Dhabi. A good indicator is also, for instance, if you look at the ambassadors, the names of the ambassadors, and if they are from Abu Dhabi, that is usually that they're close to power. And most of the big embassies of the UAE, the people that are sent there are people from Abu Dhabi. So that's, again, if I want to be blunt, I would say it has been resolved a long time ago. Abu Dhabi won. That would be my answer.
Can you talk a little bit about the collaboration between South Korea and UAE, especially in the area of security and defense?
Yes. So, and the biggest example is South Korea. South Koreans' management of the nuclear plant in the UAE. So that actually is a good example of how the UAE in 2009 decided to go for South Korea, although there were three proposals for the construction of its first nuclear reactor. There was an American proposal and there was a French proposal. And by the way, the South Koreans had no precedent experience with the construction of a nuclear plant for a foreign client. So this was a major surprise when they selected the South Koreans. What's interesting is that it came hand in hand with a defense agreement between South Korea and the UAE. We only heard about it because of a scandal in South Korean politics a few years later, where the government was toppled in South Korea because the revelation that South Korea had signed a defense agreement with the UAE, which included a clause of solidarity, that meaning that if the UAE is under attack, South Korea would come to the rescue, which is a far-fetched scenario in the sense that probably the UAE would rely first on the US before relying on South Korea. Having said that, you have military cooperation, limited cooperation. I think we're talking about 100 South Korean forces which are deployed inside the Abu Dhabi Emirates. And this is mostly special forces unit, as far as I remember. Limited cooperation, but significant. Beyond that, you will have other more classic cooperation in the domain of trade. Also in the cultural domain, there's a cultural center, a South Korean cultural center in Abu Dhabi. And there's a lot of interest for the South Korean culture, which I don't think is very unique to the UAE. I think it's more reflective of the South Korean soft power in general. But it is interesting to see that it also gained traction in the UAE. So that is, yeah, on the top of my head, the different examples that come to my mind on the South Korean presence there.
I'm just curious, is there any competition between Saudi Arabia and UAE?
Oh, yes, there is. Okay, and so right now there's the most obvious element is the business competition, in the sense that, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia announced that by 2024, this year, they wanted to have business companies to relocate their regional headquarters to Saudi Arabia. That was mostly involving the big companies that have a regional presence. Because, for instance, just anecdotal experience I remember, when I lived in Abu Dhabi, one of my neighbors worked for Booz Allen. Booz Allen has, so this is this big US consulting company that has presence across the Gulf. And their regional headquarters at the time, if I remember, were in the UAE. Except that their advisors, their consultants were commuting almost every week to Saudi Arabia, because the biggest number of contracts they had was with Saudi Arabia. So that is the reason why Saudi Arabia was forcing and is forcing companies to relocate to to Saudi Arabia, not to the UAE. So that would be right now the biggest element of the competition. But beyond that, you have topics where both countries do not agree. In Yemen, both countries intervened, but for different reasons and supporting different local actors. So Saudi Arabia is supporting the government in exile and wants the government in exile to be in charge of the reconstruction of Yemen. The Emiratis always felt like the government in exile was ineffective and was not the strongest power on the battlefield. So very quickly, they supported forces in South Yemen who were openly calling for secession. So that is the reason why suddenly people speculated UAE is actually for the secession of Yemen. They are for separatist groups. The UAE would argue that this was more a pragmatic move. They were looking for effective partners on the ground, and these were the southerner forces, not the government in exile. So that is one example. But keep in mind, there's also, and I'll stop on that, there's also unresolved territorial dispute between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is a dispute that has been lingering since 1971. And both countries, from time to time, will remind the international community that there is this dispute. Right now, it's toned down because both countries don't want to discuss it. But back in 2009, you can check the newspapers at the time. They almost came to a clash between armed forces at the border because of that. So that is something that should be kept in mind. That right now is not, I would say, at the top of the agenda of both countries. But technically, there is still this dispute which is in the air.